Soldier Mage King, Chapter 19. The Witchfinder. Gaius could not allow Merlin to be killed. He didn't even want Iridian speaking to Merlin, but one small, careless, truly harmless show of magic had Uther summoning the Witchfinder. He had no oversight. It made him dangerous. Morgana he would not touch physically. Not with Uther footing his bill, but Merlin was not afforded that protection. She came back from her questioning, shaking slightly, bruises on her wrists. Gaius thought it was a bit of an irony that Iridian had managed to target the only 3 actual magic users he knew of in Camelot, despite his evidence being fabricated. He'd never seen the bracelet Iridian claimed as his proof before, but claimed it was his to save Merlin the Pyre. He knew Iridian would not stop until he got one person, but even that, it seemed, would not be enough for him. He gloated to Gaius that he would have Lady Morgana and Merlin burn as well. Gaius could do nothing but wait for the pyre. The fact that Arthur postponed it gave him some small hope, but he had no idea what was going on. He sat on the pile of straw that served as a cot and stared up through the window of his cell, wondering if this would be the last time he saw sunlight. Arthur was impressed at Merlin's findings. She and Gwen seemed to have teamed up and discovered that Iridian was forcing the local apothecary to sell eye drops containing belladonna, which would have caused hallucinations. He threatened to claim he was a sorcerer if he hadn't sold Iridian's mixture. All of his so-called witnesses had bought the contaminated eye drops. These claims are clearly unfounded. The girl is simply trying to protect her master. Iridian bit out, stepping closer to Merlin. Arthur tensed, but Merlin stood her ground. Perhaps he's been teaching her more than the healing arts. Iridian accused. Arthur had had enough. Then you won't mind us searching your chambers, Arthur said, stepping forward so he was level with Merlin. That seemed to give Iridian pause. He hadn't expected that. He scoffed. I have nothing to hide, he said, echoing Merlin's words from just a few days ago. Arthur snagged Merlin by the sleeve. It wasn't standard procedure to have the accuser with the guards while they searched for evidence of witchcraft, but Morgana was coming too, so it hardly mattered. That was until they found a cabinet full of the eye drops and the same bracelet Iridian claimed to have found in Gaius's chambers. Arthur yanked Morgana behind him as Iridian tried to claim he knew nothing about this, that Merlin was setting him up. He seemed to choke on his words as his accusations flew until he was doubled over. Something was coming out of Iridian's mouth. Morgana screamed as a toad climbed out of Iridian's throat and landed on the floor, petulantly croaking up at the man. Uther drew his sword. Sorcery, he accused, and real fear flashed in Iridian's eyes. Fear like Arthur had seen before, the type of fear that made one go mad in an attempt to escape. Though Morgana was safe behind Arthur, no one had thought to keep Merlin from standing towards the front of the group, as she was wont to do, rules of propriety be damned. Iridian seized her by the shoulder, making her cry out. He pressed a dagger to her throat, and Arthur's heart seized in his chest. Merlin had frozen, fear warring with something else on her face. You'll never leave the city alive, Arthur snarled. If he hurt Merlin, he wouldn't be making it out of this room alive. Merlin's eyes flicked to Arthur, then behind him to where Leon was standing, his weapon out. Out of the corner of his eye, Arthur saw Leon nod to Merlin. Before anyone else could move, Merlin drove her heel into Iridian's foot. He reeled, his hand still holding the knife to Merlin's throat, jerked outward, away from her skin. At that moment, Merlin seized his arm, jabbing 2 fingers into Iridian's wrist and snatching up the dagger as he reflexively dropped it. She managed to get a few steps away, but the damage was already done. Shocked by Merlin's unexpected resistance, Iridian had stumbled backward. His knees met a trunk behind him, and he toppled backward, straight out the window. Merlin dropped his dagger as Arthur stepped over to her. Crimson was beginning to stain her blue tunic. You're hurt, Arthur said, and Merlin glanced at her shoulder. When Iridian had reeled at her stamping on his foot, he had slashed the dagger across her shoulder. Merlin pulled her scarf off and pressed it to the bleeding wound as Leon peered carefully out of the broken window. He's dead, Leon confirmed. Arthur added his hand to Merlin's shoulder. She winced at the added pressure, but nodded, encouraging him to keep his hand there. Arthur glanced over at his father. "Have Gaius released," he ordered to the guards behind him. They nodded. "You've helped uncover a dangerous charlatan and a sorcerer to boot. See that she's cared for, Arthur," Uther said before sweeping out of the room, comforting a distraught Morgana as he went. "Take care of Iridian's body, Leon," Arthur ordered, and taking Merlin by her elbow, escorted her out of the room. It was a quick jog to the physician's quarters. The place was a mess, books on herbs strewn everywhere. Arthur deposited Merlin on one of the benches at her assistant's. "What do you need?" he asked. He might know his way around a sword, but the physician's arts had never been of interest to him. "That kit, there," Merlin said, pointing with her good arm. Arthur seized it and handed it over to Merlin, who laid it out on the table in front of her. Inside were various tools, including the needle and thread she now grabbed one-handed. "Can you thread that?" she asked, holding the needle out to Arthur. His hands shook slightly, but he did as she asked, as she wiped away the blood and tore her already cut shirt, so it was nearly falling off her shoulder, allowing her access to the cut. "Here, let me," Arthur said, and Merlin raised an eyebrow. "Have you ever stitched a wound? 'Cause I know you don't stitch your own shirts," she teased. He rolled his eyes. "It can't be that hard," he insisted. She rolled her eyes, snatching the needle from him and pressing it through skin, beginning her stitches. Arthur watched, slightly horrified at the practiced motion Merlin made as she stitched her own flesh back together. "Scissors," she requested, nodding to the kit as she tied off the stitching. Arthur scrambled for them and watched, a little nauseous as she clipped off the thread. The door opened and Leon led Gaius in. The older man was shaking slightly. Merlin leapt up and helped Leon maneuver Gaius to the patient cot he used as a bed. Gaius reached out and pulled her into a hug. "My girl, thank you," he muttered, and Arthur turned away as Merlin's shoulders began to shake. He nodded to Leon. "See, they have everything they need. You're better at the medical side of things. Help with what you can. I'll have the kitchen send up dinner," he ordered. He made for the door. "Arthur," Merlin called out, and Arthur turned. She turned to him with a blinding smile on her face. "Thank you for listening to me," she said, and he nodded, not trusting his voice.